In the spring of 1834, deep in the hills of central Virginia, a discovery was made that would forever reshape how we understand the capacity for human cruelty. In the basement of what seemed to be an ordinary farmhouse, authorities found 47 children ages 6 to 16 chained and hidden away. The children looked nothing alike, spoke various languages, and when asked who had brought them there, they could only whisper one name through their tears: Mother Sullivan. A sheriff's report, buried for over a century in the Henry County archives, described the scene as so disturbing that 3 officers involved in the investigation quit within a week. What makes the case truly horrifying isn't just what was found, but the fact that Constance Sullivan managed to run this hidden operation for more than 20 years without anyone noticing. The children called her mother, but the reality behind that title was far more chilling. Before we dive deeper into the story of the Sullivan family and the dark secrets they kept, let me ask you something. This channel is for people who don't look away from the darker side of history. If you're still watching, you're not someone who turns back when things get uncomfortable. So, if you're with us, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state are you watching from. Are you ready to hear a story that might have unfolded in a place not far from your own? The question that haunted investigators in 1834 and still puzzles historians today is how such a large-scale crime went unnoticed for so long in a quiet, close-knit community. Virginia, at that time, was caught between the old ways of plantation life and the early stirrings of industrial change. The small town of Millbrook, home to about 50 families in Henry County, reflected the typical rural life of the era. Most folks farmed tobacco or corn, traded at the local general store, and gathered for events at a shared one-room schoolhouse. The Sullivan farm sat just beyond the main part of town. It looked ordinary, a modest, 2-story farmhouse on 100 acres of fertile land to travelers on the dusty road between Millbrook and Richmond. It was just another family farm. The house was built in the popular Federal style of the 1810s. With white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch, a red barn stood behind it, along with a smokehouse and chicken coop. But what made the Sullivan property unusual couldn't be seen from the road. Ezra Sullivan, who bought the land in 1809 with money from his father's tobacco fortune, had gone to great lengths to expand the basement. While most homes in the region had only small root cellars, the Sullivan basement stretched far beyond the footprint of the house above. Local laborers remembered being hired for digging and construction throughout the 1810s and 20s, but none had seen the final result. Ezra paid generously and always in cash, asking workers to stick to their assigned sections without asking questions. Constance Sullivan arrived in Millbrook in 1811 as a 22-year-old bride. She was remembered as soft-spoken, neat in her appearance, and known for attending church when her health allowed. She had a reputation for charity, often explaining that she and Ezra were caring for orphaned relatives from Pennsylvania. She insisted the arrangement was temporary just until suitable homes could be found. This explanation was enough for the townspeople. Occasionally, someone would catch a glimpse of a child riding in the Sullivan wagon when Constance came into town. They never spoke, but she always had an answer. They were shy, still mourning their parents, and adjusting to life on the farm. Thomas Henderson, who ran the general store, recalled Constance as a consistent customer. Every 2 weeks, she came, with a long shopping list and enough cash to buy large quantities of flour, cornmeal, pork, molasses, and basic medicine. The amount seemed excessive for a couple without children, but when he asked, she reminded him of the orphans in her care. She said many of them were sickly and needed treatment. Neighbors sometimes found the Sullivan schedule odd. Unlike most farming families who worked from sunup to sundown, the Sullivan property stayed active into the night. Lights burned late, and the sound of hammering echoed across the fields at strange hours. When asked, Ezra would say he was making room for more children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a physician who served the area, remembered visiting the farm a few times during the 1820s and 30s. Each time, Constance told him a child had fallen ill, but he was never allowed to examine the children directly. She said they were too frightened of strangers, too traumatized to see a male doctor. She described the symptoms and asked for specific medicines. Even the town's pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, believed the Sullivans were doing good work. He often praised their generosity and offered to help place the children in homes. But Constance assured him that her relatives in Pennsylvania were already arranging adoptions. It was just taking time. In truth, Constance Sullivan had spent more than 2 decades building and maintaining a lie. These children weren't relatives waiting for new homes. They were captives bought, stolen, or lured from families across state lines. What they endured in that basement is difficult to imagine. The truth started to unravel in early 1834 after a string of unrelated incidents. That February was brutally cold, with weeks of below-freezing temperatures. For the 47 children locked beneath the Sullivan house, that winter was both a curse and, eventually, a blessing. On February 23rd, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was on his way from Richmond to Charlottesville when a snowstorm forced him off the road. The Sullivan farm, visible in the distance, was the only shelter nearby. Ezra was clearly hesitant, but couldn't refuse a traveler in distress. Stern later described the night as deeply unsettling. Constance served a simple meal, cornbread and salt pork, but the conversation was strained. The couple seemed nervous, exchanging glances and reacting to every small sound. When Stern asked about the children, Constance said they were sleeping and shouldn't be disturbed. She claimed they'd been sick with fever. What stayed with Stern most, though, was a sound. As he lay on a makeshift bed in the parlor, he heard what sounded like muffled crying from beneath the floorboards. When he asked Ezra about it in the morning, he was told it was just the wind passing through the foundation, nothing unusual in an old house, especially in winter. Stern accepted the answer, but left with a lingering sense of unease. The second turning point came about 3 weeks later, on March 15th. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant traveling with her family in search of work near Richmond, became separated during a river crossing. Cold, alone, and terrified, she eventually stumbled upon the Sullivan farm. As farm was likely just the beginning of something even larger and more organized. Authorities feared that if not for the accidental events of early 1834, the operation might have continued and even expanded undetected. The physical evidence, along with the testimonies of survivors and witnesses, led to the immediate arrest of both Ezra and Constance Sullivan. Ezra was taken into custody without incident. Constance, however, had to be forcibly restrained after a failed attempt to ingest a vial of laudanum hidden in her garments. She survived and was placed under constant watch. The trial that followed was one of the most shocking and closely followed legal proceedings of the time. Courtrooms were packed, newspapers across the country printed every detail, and people who had once respected the Sullivan family were left speechless by the scope of the crimes. Witnesses testified to the horrific conditions inside the Sullivan basement. Survivors described punishments, starvation, and constant fear. Experts analyzed the coded correspondence and financial records, while law enforcement from 5 states contributed evidence of disappearances that traced back to the Sullivans. Despite her initial denials, the overwhelming evidence forced Constance Sullivan to confess to many of the charges. She claimed her actions had started with good intentions, that she had truly intended to care for orphans at first, but that she had been overwhelmed by the burden and made difficult choices. The court rejected this defense outright. Her network, her record-keeping, and her strategic manipulation of those around her showed clear intent and planning. Ezra Sullivan, though less vocal during the trial, was found equally responsible. Testimony from the children confirmed he had played an active role in their abuse and control. Both were convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, child abuse, and murder. Due to the laws of the time and the evolving nature of federal jurisdiction, some charges could not be tried, but the sentence was clear. Both Ezra and Constance Sullivan were sentenced to death. They were hanged in a public execution on September 12, 1835. In front of a crowd of nearly 5,000 people. It was one of the largest public gatherings in the region's history. In the months and years that followed, the Sullivan case sparked changes in how missing children were reported and tracked. It led to greater cooperation between state authorities and eventually helped shape early conversations about national law enforcement coordination, though it would be many years before national databases or child protection agencies were formed. The horrors discovered beneath that quiet farmhouse became a driving force for reform. A memorial was later erected on the site of the Sullivan farm, now a field reclaimed by time. The names of the 47 rescued children were engraved on a plaque, alongside those whose remains were never fully identified. It stands not only as a remembrance of lives lost and harmed, but as a warning of what can happen when cruelty hides behind a mask of kindness and when silence is allowed to prevail. The legacy of the Sullivan case remains a dark chapter in American history, one that still raises questions about complicity, deception, and the responsibilities of a community. And while it's difficult to revisit stories like these, they serve an important purpose, reminding us that truth, no matter how buried or disturbing, must eventually come to light. The discovery at the Sullivan farm exposed a criminal network that was on the verge of expanding far beyond what anyone had imagined. The breakthrough came from someone few expected: Rebecca, a 14-year-old girl who had survived longer than any of the other children. Unlike the others, who had been worn down by years of captivity, Rebecca remained alert and observant. She remembered details, names, dates, conversations that would prove crucial to the investigation. Rebecca had been abducted from her family's farm in Pennsylvania in 1829 when she was just 9. She recalled how a woman pretending to be a distant relative had visited the farm, offered her sweets and a ride into town, and then took her away. She woke up chained in the Sullivan basement. Over the years, she had overheard countless conversations between Constant Sullivan and the people who came to the farm. She remembered mentions of other farms, other buyers, and movements of children between different sites. One event stood out clearly in her memory. Just 2 weeks before the Sullivan farm was exposed, a well-dressed man had arrived in a carriage accompanied by 2 others. Rebecca and 3 other children had been lined up for inspection. The man checked their teeth, their posture, and their general health, treating them like livestock. In the end, he declined to purchase any of them, saying they were too damaged, but he left behind a letter with detailed requirements for the type of children he was interested in. That letter, signed H. Blackwood, included an address in Charleston, South Carolina. Authorities discovered that Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner with a long history of buying children not for housework, as he claimed, but for far more disturbing purposes. His involvement revealed a broader connection between the child trafficking network and wealthy Southern families, unlike enslaved people, who had some legal protections and whose absence might be noticed. Trafficked children had no advocates and no legal identity. They could be abused or worked to death without consequence. Further investigation showed that several other prominent families were purchasing children in similar ways. These children were being used not only for forced labor, but in medical experiments, violent games, and other disturbing practices. As investigators uncovered more, they began to face serious resistance. Threats were made against key witnesses and law enforcement. Sheriff Crawford received anonymous warnings. Deputy Webb was physically attacked. And then Timothy, one of the rescued boys who had been giving testimony, vanished from a shelter. Despite a search, he was never found. Even under pressure, the investigation moved forward. Federal marshals stepped in to provide protection. Witnesses were relocated to secure locations. The Sullivan farm was placed under guard to preserve evidence. But then, just before she was set to testify, Constant Sullivan was found dead in her jail cell. Though ruled as suicide, the timing raised suspicion. She had been ready to reveal names and connections. Her death dealt a major blow to the investigation. Then, a surprising development changed everything. Samuel Pierce, a former overseer on the Blackwood plantation, came forward. Haunted by what he had witnessed, he offered detailed testimony and documentation. He had worked for Blackwood for over 10 years and had seen firsthand what happened to the children sent there. His evidence confirmed the link between the Sullivan farm and a much larger operation. Pierce described how the plantation ran 2 separate systems, one for cotton production, using enslaved labor, and another, called the experimental quarters, where trafficked children were kept. These children were used in medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and several doctors from Charleston Medical College. They tested drugs, studied diseases, and conducted surgeries without anesthesia or proper care. Children were treated as test subjects, not people. Blackwood kept extensive records, reactions to treatments, survival rates, and even data from deliberate infections. Of the 37 children known to have been sent to Blackwood, only 4 survived long enough to be moved elsewhere. The rest died from abuse, neglect, or experimental procedures, and were buried in unmarked graves on the plantation. Pierce also revealed the names of other buyers and described a disturbing event held in 1833, a private gathering, where potential buyers watched children demonstrate obedience and endurance. Buyers could inspect them, test their reactions, and place orders. It was presented like a routine business event. The financial side was equally horrifying. Younger children fetched higher prices because they were easier to control. Those with specific traits were considered premium. Altogether, the network was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars a fortune at the time. Armed with this new information, federal marshals launched simultaneous raids across the South. They rescued over 100 additional children and seized documents, financial records, and letters connecting various parts of the network. Among those arrested were Blackwood, 2 Charleston doctors, and a Georgia legislator known to be a frequent buyer. The material uncovered painted a clear picture, a highly organized trafficking ring that had been operating for decades. The medical experiments were especially gruesome. Children had been intentionally infected with diseases, subjected to poisoned trials, and operated on with no regard for their pain. The bodies of many were never properly buried, just hidden from view. The investigation also uncovered how widespread corruption had allowed the network to flourish. Officials at orphanages and poorhouses had taken bribes, judges approved fraudulent adoptions, even some police officers had helped cover up disappearances. Legal proceedings dragged on for years. Some major players escaped justice entirely through legal loopholes or political protection. Others, like Ezra Sullivan, were held accountable. Ezra was hanged in 1836 after confessing to his crimes. Blackwood died in prison in 1841, some said by heart attack. Others believed he was poisoned. The Charleston doctors were imprisoned, and the college they were affiliated with came close to being shut down. Constance Sullivan, despite her death, remained at the center of the story. Her operation had earned her over $12,000 money she had invested in businesses and hidden accounts. Most of it was never recovered. The Sullivan house was eventually demolished, and the basement was filled with concrete. A small cemetery was built to honor the children who died there, though most remain unnamed. The aftermath of the case sparked major legal and social reforms. Virginia passed the country's first child protection laws. Other states followed suit. New federal laws were introduced to tackle human trafficking and cross-state crimes. The Sullivan case showed that local law enforcement alone couldn't deal with crimes of this scale. Public perception also shifted. The idea that individuals acting alone could care for large numbers of orphans without oversight began to seem dangerous. The phrase "another Sullivan case" became a warning, a reminder of what could happen if vigilance and accountability were ignored. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had unknowingly aided the operation, devoted the rest of his life to child welfare. He opened free clinics and advocated for better ethical standards in medicine. Sheriff Crawford was promoted to federal marshal and became one of the first to specialize in child abuse investigations. His reports became required reading for law enforcement nationwide. The children who survived faced a long road. Some, like Rebecca, were able to rebuild their lives. She went on to marry, raise a family, and live to the age of 73. But many others never fully recovered. Some struggled with trauma, addiction, or mental illness. A few passed away young from health issues linked to their captivity. The records left behind by the network helped investigators uncover other cases for years afterward. Some led to prosecutions, others came too late. But the documents confirmed one grim truth: the Sullivan farm was not an isolated case. There were others places where vulnerable children were used, abused, and discarded without notice. The case raised hard questions for the Millbrook community. How had they missed the signs? Could they have done more? It became a national conversation about responsibility, about when it's right to question what seems off. Even if someone appears respectable, the Sullivan case didn't just lead to new laws or arrests. It changed how Americans thought about child protection. It showed that evil could hide in plain sight, that exploitation could wear a friendly face, and that systems built on trust and good intentions needed checks, oversight, and accountability. The documents, testimonies, and evidence from the case are still studied today. They've become a vital part of understanding how criminal systems operate and how they can be stopped. In the end, the case was cracked not by advanced forensics or technology, but by people who did the right thing. William Hutchinson, who spoke up, Sheriff Crawford, who listened, and Rebecca, who remembered, testified, and refused to be silenced. That basement has been sealed for over a century now. But what happened there continues to echo, reminding us to protect those who can't protect themselves and to never take appearances at face value. If this story shook you, you're not alone. These are the kinds of forgotten truths that show us how dark the past can be and how important it is to keep searching for the truth. Share this video if you want more people to know what really happened. Hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into America's hidden history. Because as this case proved, even the quietest towns can have secrets buried deep. What do you think? Was everything revealed, or are there still secrets hidden in the Virginia hills? Let us know in the comments. See you in the next video.